Let me check. This meeting is being live streamed. Got it. Let the connection begin.
Good to start?
Yes, hold on. Let me cut and paste the link in. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce you to this new iteration of the Agora talk. Today, we will discover the amazing Joshanne Dar and the work she produced during her residency at Agora. To moderate the talk, please welcome Amiel Maucade, our volunteer digital curator. Amiel is a curator in contemporary and digital art, researching gender identity. Their approach is ideological, ultimately researching queer representation through culture. After graduating from La Sorbonne in philosophy, literature, and history of arts, they are pursuing a master at Central St. Martin's in culture, criticism, and curation. Amiel focuses on a broad approach to curating, from working with UNESCO to curating contemporary ceramics exhibitions in France. They believe digital creation is politically charged, especially during these pivotal times where this art form established its significance, defining our encounter with a new dominating medium. Well, Amiel, after this introduction, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Wow, what a presentation. I want to talk about Joshanne, that we've been doing this residency together. Joshanne is an Asian Australian artist. Her practice merges art direction, filmmaking, moving image, performance, sculpture, and digital installation. Her interest incorporates science, math, and psychology, attempting to create alternative discourses around social topics through deconstruction and experiments with atmosphere and subject matter. Joshanne Dar's work, Homo Ex-Machina, now playable, that she'll be presenting today, it tends to build an ongoing preoccupation with a relationship with digital technology. It has, she will say it herself, how it has permeated into our bodies and psyches. Should I hand it over back to Joshanne for her to present her work?
Hi, yeah sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll be speaking about Homo Ex-Machina, which is quite a playful approach using WebXR technology to sort of explore the liminal space in what I would consider to be this sort of cyborg relationship we have with technology. It's kind of, it's continued a long lineage with my own sort of exploration of digital tech and an attempt to create a tangibility out of this very sort of intangible virtual world that has kind of thrust itself onto our sort of necessities of living, especially in this period. I have been fascinated with the lack of tangibility of the virtual space. And also the absence of games really within a kind of fine art context. So I wanted to amalgamate sort of pop culture and science fiction interpretations of the digital with a fine art context and with my practice. Shall I go on?
If you want, yes.
Yeah, sure. The description of the game. I mean, the point of the game is to explore this digital object that stemmed from an organic bone sculpture that I made. And I was really curious with the liminal space between the physical and the digital, and translated this object into virtual space using photo mapping techniques. And sort of discovered all these errors that the machinery picked up with this mapping process that I've now kind of come to consider to be the digital hand, in the same way we have this artist hand. and sort of exploited those errors using animation technology, which I myself have encountered in a very kind of exploratory way over the past couple of years. But find it fascinating because, again, it allows us to have a grip, have a tactility to the virtual space, which I think is massively powerful. I grew up with video games and with a real interest in physical materials. And I was fascinated with the game's ability to allow you to permeate behind the glass and interact with this imagery that was kind of presented as an absolute to you. And it has these physics to it that don't apply to the real world, and this sort of reverence towards it because of that, because it's kind of, it represents both limitations and also like an impossibility of potential that we don't, I mean, I don't fully understand. I think people find kind of intriguing. But to continue on, I think I digressed a little bit. So the space, the object, the digital object, this organic object was photo mapped and then manipulated with software kind of almost erroneously. And I really wanted to explore what the actual physics of this digital object were. And it translated into a game kind of serendipitously after collaborating with Alex Tennyson of Type 1, who is an amazing coder. And together we just sort of explored the possibilities of sharing this tactility with the viewer and engaging with virtual objects in a more kind of holistic sort of way. The point of the game is to explore and try and navigate this sort of impossible space, this object which is floating in this kind of void space. And then you kind of discover all the little Easter eggs and kind of fun coding bits along the way. I don't know how much to say. I don't want to reveal too much because it's kind of a cool thing of exploring it. But yeah, you're kind of, the point is sort of to be blissfully marooned onto this elongated shape floating within this void of potential that is, in my mind, the digital. It continues a narrative that I've built into my practice of the cyborg human and of, I suppose, imagining what the digital counterpart to the cyborg human machine symbiosis is experiencing, what it looks like, how it works. And I consider, I think, a lot of objects of my practice to be this kind of imagined revealing of these processes based on my own research of digital spaces, of AI, of WebXR technology, trying to translate that into something that is quite enjoyable and reflective of these spaces.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I think there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of strats and depth into your research and your production and art in general. I think it's really interesting. And there's, to sort of start with some questions to try to decipher, to try to find a sort of like a lineage in what you're saying. Is it I see there's a lot of like plays on dualities that I find interesting to talk about, with this sort of play of digital and organic, of our matter and the digital. Could you firstly sort of take us through the process of, for instance, titling this work Homo Ex-Machina?
I think the duality comes from, I mean, I think I speak a lot about the binary in this kind of machine, man, organic, inorganic, artificial, natural sort of dynamic. But my own, I sort of position on it is that it's sort of just to debunk this binary on the whole idea. So the title is literally translates to how one becomes machine man. And it's an idea that permeates through my research of how, I mean, exactly that has happened, how our faculties have been extended by the technology that we come into contact with, and how the binary between natural and artificial is one I think we sort of quite anthropocentrically create. So it's almost kind of like a tongue-in-cheek kind of title, to be honest with you. My argument would be that machine is already, man and machine, but we kind of become the same thing. And yeah, the now playable is very much so a kind of, I mean, the Latin is a reference to more institutionalized forms of of knowledge, I suppose, and the way in which we categorize these things into binaries often. I still think we're kind of in this very post-humanistic reign of categorizing information in quite anthropocentric ways. And this new introduction of digital power and technology and artificial intelligence is debunking a lot of those assumptions that I think a lot of our information is based on. So the title kind of touches on all of those things.
I see. It's a very interesting approach, like a playful approach in deconstructing and analyzing this relationship. And in the same way, I see a very strong reference to science fiction in your work, for instance, especially in this one, right? It makes me think of a stranded individual on a planet. Is it relevant to talk about like the experimentation of your work as enjoyable or ominous, like as the invigilators would be walking on this stranded, on this hovering, shiny planet? Is it relevant to talk about then an enjoyable or ominous experience, and where does your work sort of lie in this dichotomy?
I think it's relevant probably in the sense of I would be curious to see what people interpreted out of it, whether they did find it enjoyable or ominous. I've really presented it according to how my contact with the materials, with the digital materials and technology have allowed it to sort of be allowed it to be presented, sorry. And it's sitting in a void, but it's also sitting in this kind of galaxy space. It's this kind of like digital nexus of interconnectivity. And I think this is probably the desire to present the virtual space as this space of potential, not as like a void of absence. Science fiction is very much so relevant to my practice. I think it's like, so much about understanding of digital spaces, of artificial intelligence, have come from this long obsession with science fiction, which is both beautiful and ominous. And I think that really encapsulates the tone of our encounters with two new technologies, because no one really knows what they're going to shape up to be. But one as powerful as the digital definitely deserves a little bit of probably weight attached to how it's presented. It's not necessarily intentionally implanted into the work, but as it's been almost a mapping of my progress with the technology, I think that a lot of that thought process is laid into it.
I see, yeah. It would be inevitable to have this tension in the works, because it obviously sort of is a continuation of the questions that all the investment of the advancement of digital art creates. So it's a sort of another work that would crystallize these questions. That's really interesting. And I mean, to go back to the same sort of duality and tension, I think that the tension between organic and digital is really present in the way the audience has to interact with it. There's this sort of playful approach on this tension, and as a sort of like this work points it out basically and sheds light on this discussion between digital and organic. What's your thought process behind, for instance, using a bone and organic matter as a host planet? Can you tell a little bit more about that?
I think it's simultaneously, well, it does simultaneously come from my obsession with natural materials, and I think my Australian upbringing and unearthing these artifacts of like natural histories. That was my main material as a kid, was these bones and bits and objects, and like trying to identify where they sort of fit in with my surroundings. And I think this bone definitely represents the same thing, and it's also, for me to translate this object, this bone, which has mortality like inlaid into its existence, into a virtual space which is completely immortal, was just playing with that sort of tension of different realities.
I see. Yeah, that's another sort of portrayal of this tension, then, the mortality and immortality in digital and organic. I think it's a really fascinating tension.
I hope they're kind of represented somewhat harmoniously in the piece, I suppose, because I do think that a lot of these binaries are things that we sort of construct and use to catalog the data around us, but the way in which we use these things doesn't really reflect attention per se. I think people have kind of integrated very naturally into technology. I suppose it's both to highlight attention, but also the unnecessity of the tension. That is maybe too ambitious a thing to do with an artwork.
No, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be this binary sort of system or this binary measure or construct. And I think these kind of works, this digital artwork, for instance, goes towards a sort of like an idea of a deconstruction and of these what I call tension. But it's just interesting to use all the different point of references to me allude to something that seems like, as you said, very personal with your upbringing in the fauna of Australia, for instance. So it's interesting to see how you're projecting your personal experience and memories into like sort of crystallization, universe, digital realm. I think it's really interesting. You've mentioned as well that this work sort of, is it logical continuation or a representation of your practice? Will it be an ongoing art piece, or is it already an ongoing art piece? Is it something that you tweak and sort of perfect or change with time, or is it just crystallized? Do you develop it, tweak it through time, or is it a sort of finished, completely finished artwork in a sense that you wouldn't want to go back to it to mend it because it's digital? You have this possibility, right? Is that relevant for your work?
I think absolutely. I mean, the piece as it is finished in the sense that it will exist on this particular web address for, well, I mean, forever, for as long as the internet is around and we still have access to the server. I would really like to continue. I will be continuing to develop it as much as my sort of eloquency with the technology allows me, and continue to explore these different sort of discoveries and inlay them into the work. The object itself has very much so been with me throughout a lot of my practice, and I think I have definitely almost like personified it as this character, this sort of dual identity in the digital space, and it's very sort of existence and the way it looks and the way it behaves and the kind of incantations of where it goes into and the mediums it manifests into, of which there is quite a few, including like films and still images, and actually most recently I made a cameo in a music video, is part of its sort of journey. And I wanted to pick up all of these little these ways in which it sort of manifests as being a part of its digital history. So in that way it kind of maps this whole progress of things. But having said that, this actual piece will still exist as it is, because again, I don't really want to erase the history of things, which is what I find to be, again, slightly intangible about the virtual space, is that you can never really see how things have existed before because your access to them is so organized by the like user experience and yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Do you think that's something that could be applicable to some of your other, because this one seems like a very personal sort of personal blueprint of your digital abilities and the logistics of your digital art. So it's a sort of mind map of your experimentation with digital art. Is it something that is applicable to your other works, or is it really this art piece that crystallizes this timely, experimentation and development, personal, artistic, creative process development sort of
process? I would say that it's quite applicable to my practice. It's definitely, as you mentioned before, I have quite a background in science and in mathematics and in logic and in experiments, and I think I treat a lot of my practice as experiments, and so the sort of results of them are quite crucial, and I like to be transparent about where it's gone and what has happened with different things, because I think a lot of that becomes the work itself, the performance of these different experiments. And I like to work with mediums and with methods I'm not really comfortable with, and also not disguise any of that discomfort with the final piece. You'll notice in this particular piece there is a lot of I guess errors. There's things that don't really make user experience, user experience, user journey sense according to like the kind of digital rules of what runs websites usually. And I found them really enjoyable. I didn't really want to get rid of them. The code I was working with was like, really? And I was just like, yeah, but they become a part of the work, and I think we always expect virtual spaces to behave quite well. And I really wanted to sort of resist that with this one.
Yeah, that makes sense. It used to be maybe always based on some kind of user experience, as you said, and this seems to have the sort of foundational aspect of foundational approach of user experience, with having, you know, for instance, falling eternally when you, well, I shouldn't say too much, but you have this possibility of there's no winning or losing, right? There's more of a possibility of endlessly losing yourself into the digital nexus, but
yeah,
maybe we should leave that to the experience.
I think it's probably relevant to say then that the game is not necessarily in a game that we've constructed. Well, I've constructed, but it's more the game is exploring the technology of the particular website.
Okay, I see. I wanted to talk about a bit. I'm sorry if you mentioned it before, but the white orbs, I think was something that was really that really had this video game element. I was just wondering, to have a sort of lighter question, why white orbs? If that's relevant anywhere.
Why white orbs?
Just curious about it.
It was either white orbs or white squares that were available in the kind of coding. I'm sorry to like kind of unveil that as being something quite arbitrary, but the presence, I mean, why white orbs? I think they were quite visible in the dark space. But the reason you can kind of shoot them was, again, to just kind of be able to understand and have a little bit more awareness of your surroundings as you're kind of roaming through it, because obviously it feels a bit different when you've just got like a square screen and you're moving through it versus when you can kind of actually like shoot into it, and the viewpoint is kind of fixed as the center of your screen as opposed to like a navigatable thing, which very much so makes it about like what your screen is doing within the space. Yeah.
It also has a sort of like it really crystallizes your approach on, or your video game making piece, and is also in a way reassuring, because I was talking about like my sort of personal view on it as being possibly ominous, but having these white orbs is something that seems to really make it playful, as a sort of more imminent playfulness to it. So it's really interesting. I mean, thank you very much for all this, all your presentation. What's next for you? What's next for Joshanne Dar?
I think to just continue this this sort of artistic journey of digital spaces, translating them more into physical sort of installations now that we have a little bit more access to unremote spaces is quite exciting. I'm naturally quite a sort of like three-dimensional sort of physical artist, and I think a lot of my interest in digital spaces is how to translate them to our bodies, into our hands, into our perception of our phenomenology of spaces. At the moment, I am continuing to work on this particular piece and make the physics of the space a little bit more complicated. So we're going to hit the FTP coding pretty hard soon, and then continue to work in the digital sense. I mean, quite excitingly, probably taking my practice over to Singapore very soon to explore things from a different cultural perspective.
I see. Would it be the sort of digital art scene of Singapore, or a more broad new media art, or would it be actually your installations, for instance?
I think I would definitely like to continue exploring the digital side of things, but honestly, kind of any art. Like, I was never initially a digital artist, and I'm really, again, interested in experimenting with mediums. I'm really curious about how I think various topics sort of manifest and how you can express them creatively. So I will always be very kind of obsessed with digital art, but I think I couldn't really say that I'm going to continue exactly with that.
Okay, that's super interesting. And I mean, congratulations on graduating the BA Fine Arts of Central St. Martin.
Thank you very much.
That must have been really exciting to do. And I guess this is where you sort of probably learned about, did you have a knowledge of digital art or techniques about it prior to this, like this BA, or was it?
Absolutely not. I was very much so a little bit perhaps like stick in the mud about avoiding digital art. I've always grown up being like a sculptor and a painter and a drawer and an illustrator, and I found a lot of comfort in these more traditional art making forms. I like things you can touch, and then very much so transitioned into digital art out of the observation that it is such an important and all permeating element of our modern world that I couldn't very well just be like, I don't like it and refuse to move it. So as in a more solution orientated direction, I was like, I'm going to try and build this tactility that I love so much about the physical world into the virtual world. And I don't think that has finished at all with Homo Ex-Machina. I would like to continue building on that.
Nice, because you've mentioned this this idea of this idea of comfort as the manual works, or constructing art pieces with your hands as something comforting or comfortable. Would you think that it is something that's not as present in the digital space, or that you're trying to sort of project or find again into this digital art? Is it a question in your creative process?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it, I think just because, again, like the rules that apply to like physical work and the physical reality don't apply to the virtual space. And we are very much so sitting here in this context, we are in the virtual space, but our thought process and our feelings and stuff, they all come from this virtual world. So I suppose amalgamating and like elucidating how these worlds function as well. A lot of my work as well is kind of a little bit more didactical about various elements of digital technology, I think primarily artificial intelligence, which we've kind of just skyrocketed into this like sci-fi reality of having AI, having thinking machines built into our day-to-day processes and our smartphones. Like it's everywhere at the moment. So yeah, it's kind of, it's very much so a constantly reminded sort of topic to research. I think I digressed a little bit there with your question, but did that kind of answer it?
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. Did you ever, for instance, I mean, maybe to sort of close this entire wonderful talk, did you work with AI on your pieces or some pieces?
Yeah, there's actually a great app called Runway in which you can access a lot of open source AI algorithms to a limited degree. So I have definitely been dabbling with those as much as possible, particularly GTP2, that's a mouthful, which is a language text processor whose kind of older brother, GTP3, has actually achieved sentience according to the Turing test. So they've had to reformat the Turing test in order to actually represent sentience of the machine accurately, because it's so good at using human language patterns at replicating communication, basically, which I find fascinating.
That is fascinating.
It really is.
Ominous.
AI in general is a bit expensive to dabble around with, but there's a lot of open source stuff that I think is brilliant. Would definitely encourage everyone to go and explore, because it really shows how, especially at this stage where we haven't perfected it, where like AI is very much so being developed, you're able to see how it thinks through the errors it makes. Especially with language, with the way it sort of produces images, with the way it captures and identifies things, it uses data and it thinks about them in the same way a human brain does at a very arbitrary level. And it's definitely fleshed out a lot of my practice and a lot of this imagined space to actually be able to interact with artificial intelligence in quite a transparent way. But we do it all the time. It's in Spotify, it's in your like Instagram algorithm, all of these things, like everything at this point uses AI to primarily, I think, target information at you, but with a lot of others as well.
I see. I mean, yeah, definitely, it is omnipresent, and I mean, it sounds really exciting to see how. I'm maybe not going to ask you this because it seemed like maybe it's part of your creative process that's ongoing and really happening now, but it would be fascinating to see how you will incorporate that into your work, whether it's text, whether it's sort of video imagery, um, or any kind of new media with AI. I think is definitely really topical and fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing your research, your creative process, this Homo Ex-Machina playable work with us. And I mean, it was a really interesting residency. So thank you very much.
I mean, thank you both for this opportunity, for working with me, for supporting the work. It's been a real pleasure to work with Agora Gallery.
Nice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joshanne, for this very interesting work. And in fact, well, I must say that I discovered it with the audience. So it was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Would anyone like Bildred have a question to ask or to Joshanne? Listening to the journey and the work. Yes, well, stay tuned because as Joshanne mentioned, this is an evolving project, so we will possibly see more, right? So
yeah.
Do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there somewhere where we can see most of it? Apart, I think there's a profile on the website anyway, isn't there? But is there somewhere where we can access this one?
Oh, of course, yeah. I believe the link is embedded.
Then we follow it and see how it evolves over time as you work on it progressively.
Absolutely. I mean, I plan on keeping communications open with Agora Digital, but also will be on my social media.
Instagram, Joshanne Dar or Joshanne?
It's going to be Joshanne Dar.
Joshanne Dar, okay.
We'll put all the follow-up information on. I can post the link to the work on the chat as well. It exists as a website, so anyone can access it. It kind of lives online.
Oh yes, please, if you can share it and then I'll place it. Fantastic. Well, shall I stop the live? Yeah.